Alright, so this one's like a month in the making. So let's talk about two more releases from 2023. And we're going to start with Barbie, which obviously I'm like a month late on. So I don't really know what I can say that probably hasn't been brought up by somebody. But there is a context for how I saw Barbie and Blue Beetle, which was I was starting to get concerned because Barbie was, blowing up and becoming this phenomenon, and it was just all kind of passing by, and I didn't know what the big deal was. And then finally, it showed up at a drive-in with these two playing together. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna finally jump on this and see what's going on with Barbie and why it's got the status right now that it does. And not that I was like against its existence or anything. Just one thing it had going against it with me right away is I've been making it clear for a while now that I'm not the biggest Greta Gerwig fan. I think Lady Bird I thought was really good, but apart from that, I just don't really respond to her stuff up to this point. So there's that, and also just the hype around it. I feel like was gonna be. I was afraid that there were two things actually. Not only was it just the hype it was getting, but I am glad I didn't do the whole Barbie Oppenheimer thing in retrospect, because when I saw Oppenheimer, which I ended up seeing twice, I thought it was flawless. So the hype that it already has to try to live up to, on top of being often paired with Oppenheimer in this sort of pop culture boom that happened, I feel like is a lot of pressure to put on it. But yeah, as far as how else I felt about it, it was just I didn't really know what it was. Like, I was hearing word because I avoid trailers and all that stuff and looking at stuff up. I try to, and so had no idea what exactly she was doing with it, but apparently it was something like surprisingly profound and surprisingly deep for and being more than just like a Barbie movie or whatever. But I had no idea where exactly it was going when I went into it. So even a month later, I was still pretty blind to it when it started. So I do remember hearing that this 2001 thing was like the first teaser trailer, so it kind of surprised me. Actually a scene in the movie, the opening scene, and it is this very clever sort of not. It is also setting the vibe of there's going to be a lot of stuff that's like, as far as like, is this a kids movie or isn't it? Because it is PG-13, but it does also have the look and vibe of a kids movie throughout it, which is a really interesting mesh. But yeah, you're gonna have stuff like very long references to 2001 that kids probably won't know for another 10 years at least, 10 or 15 years at least. But I think I was in 8th grade the first time I saw 2001, and this will be one of those movies where we were actually, or we're going to talk about eventually, which is kids movies that where we didn't get it for a long time, and then finally we would, in retrospect, and it's like, oh, I didn't get that joke till now, and I didn't get that joke till now. So it is nice to see that this will be one of those movies where there's almost kind of a nostalgia factor to that, where it's like, this is pretty much what kids movies used to be, movies that were basically PG-13, and basically was a lot of stuff we didn't get. So I'll be interested to see how the kids that are seeing Barbie now, how they feel about it when they grow up. I feel like it's going to be one of those things where there's a whole phenomenon in some years down the road where it's going to be like a lot of kids saying, oh, damn, I just got this joke in Barbie, and that's going to be a whole thing. And that's fun. So I actually really like that about it. Also, these sets of like Barbie Land itself, and I have been hearing that they were actual sets and not green screen, and that's really impressive if that's the case, and just a real breath of fresh air if that's the case, because the way this sort of comes to life, it was like I imagine there's been a lot of comparisons to Toy Story, if I had to guess. Like, it's basically a live-action version of Toy Story, and for everything to sort of be practical and bring like an actual toy world to life, and especially in the way that it does and with the detail that it does, that's really wild. So I definitely appreciate that also, just from a production standpoint, and also the way they use the musical numbers. Because I have movies like, I mean, let's say this is, this could be called a kids movie because it did have, that audience certainly showed up in like droves on top of, older audiences also. I think the marketing was, if you love Barbie and if you hate Barbie, you're gonna love both sides can live in harmony for this movie. Um, I I have really no connection to Barbie at all. Like, I knew Barbie was a thing, but as a kid, but that's all I really knew. I knew there was Barbie and Ken in a dream house, and that's pretty much the extent of my knowledge. So I'm assuming in this introduction, when we get all the different sort of Barbies and all the different sort of stuff, I'm assuming that's referencing actual things. Like, it reminded me of the opening of Into the Spider-Verse, when they were going through the Spider-Man history and, like, all the merchandise that came out that was associated with Spider-Man. So I'm going to assume, like that, where it's like, oh my god, was that actually really a thing? I'm going to assume, like, the joke is that the more outlandish those introductions got, the more it's like, those were probably real things, if I had to guess. So that's stuff that's probably lost on me, but assuming that's what the jokes are, I can appreciate that also. As far as the cast goes, obviously, I don't know who else other than Margot Robbie was going to play this. Where it was one of those things where when she was cast, it almost seemed so obvious that that was another reason I wasn't that interested in the movie at the start. Where it's like, oh, but it's a case where when you see it, actually within the movie in the context, and the fact that they even joke about it at one point in the narration, it's like, yeah, it actually makes perfect sense that they went with the most obvious person, because that kind of ends up working into the theme as it goes on. But in the way that she was able to do not just some surprisingly emotional scenes, there's a moment when she's in the real world and she's at like a bus stop and she's looking around at a bunch of different people and everybody's emoting differently, where like somebody will be sad or somebody will be crying and then somebody will be happy and laughing or whatever, or somebody will just be content, and it's almost like it's her learning emotions, but it's also this vibe of whenever we see somebody going through something, we kind of start to feel that for them. So it's like Barbie discovering empathy, essentially. So, like, when she looks at somebody sad, it genuinely starts to make her feel sad, and then she'll literally, like, look to the right, and then somebody will be laughing, and then she'll start laughing. And it's like, that's that thing where it might look sort of alien, where it's like she's learning emotions, but at the same time, it's like, that's kind of the way humans act. Like, we respond to an emotion by sharing that emotion, and then, so it's like, so it's the idea of also becoming human, I suppose. But that's the sort of serious side of it. As far as her, like, having comedic timing with certain lines, or when she has to do, they do this thing that sounds like it wouldn't work at all, but it actually does quite well, and that's when she goes into doll physicality, where it's like either the way she stands is a whole plot point, or there's moments where like she'll fall over, and she has like doll physics, is something that surprise like if you just say it, it sounds like it wouldn't work at all, but it like totally does, and I guess that's the way you could describe most of the movie. And another character in here, obviously, that's getting a lot of attention is Ryan Gosling. I think he's becoming so quickly iconic that I guess, like, all of his merchandise, like, sold out, like, right away or something when they first put it out. And I can see where that's coming from, where he's this... Interestingly enough, I guess you could say he's the villain of the story, at least for most of it. Where he comes out into the real world and gets all the wrong ideas and then takes them back to Barbie Land. And then it essentially becomes their civilization is starting to turn into our civilization and all that. And Gosling has the energy for this. Because the thing about Gosling is he has a lot of the, like, you look at Drive or The Place Beyond the Pines or his other dramatic roles, and it's like he tends to have this very sort of, only God forgive anything he's done with Refn. This very sort of, he went into the stoic thing for a while, where it looks like he's just kind of not emoting at all. Um, and it's, I mean, there's definitely things behind these performances, but that's what it would look like on the surface. But he got so far into that I feel like people forgot how great at comedy he can be. Because even like some of his earlier dramatic stuff, like Half Nelson and stuff, and like some of his legal movies, he always had like a sense of humor that was coming through. And then when you look at stuff like Crazy Stupid Love, and it's like he's actually extremely capable of comedy. And if that wasn't completely known before, it 150,000% is now. With this being I mean, he has those moments also where he's like sort of discovering human emotions, and he's starting to become a more layered character after he was intentionally one note for a while, because that was like the point. But the whole time, whether he's intentionally one note and when the layers are starting to come out, even in a lot of his serious scenes and a lot of his revelations, the character's pretty much constantly funny, which could be kind of a hard tightrope to walk. But if you want to talk about somebody walking into a movie and just being game for anything, that's what it feels like is going on with Gosling here. There's even moments when he's like bummed out, like at the beginning when they're doing a bunch of dance sequences, which I was going to talk about, and I think I cut myself off. But the way they incorporate like music and dancing into this, I typically associate with, you know, kids movies just kind of having filler. But the way they incorporate these and use them in a funny way, in a way that also kind of tells the story, interestingly enough, sometimes literally, like in the lyrics, but then other times it'll be like, you know, when all the guys are singing around all the different campfires and stuff like that. It's not only funny, but it's kind of like proving a point also. But the way Gosling is able to embrace this stuff also, where like his, you know, Mickey Mouse Club roots and his La La Land roots are all kind of converging into one, among many other things. And there's a moment where he's like bummed out at the beginning, and he's dancing in tune with everybody, like everybody is in sync, but at the same time you can tell that he's like checked out because he's bummed out about this interaction he just had with Barbie, or maybe lack of interaction he had with Barbie. And so, yeah, and the way he's like sort of being defiant against Barbie, but also like desperately wants her, and how he's warring with himself over that. There's a lot going on in the Gosling performance that I really like, and that comes through. And like I said, the fact that he's funny throughout, I feel like, is what really makes it really work at the end of the day. I was talking about Toy Story. There are a lot of references here, but there's also stuff that and some funny references, like that. When you're referencing other things, sometimes it can be kind of forced, but these work their way in pretty organically and like in genuinely funny ways. But there were other cases where I don't know how intentional some of them were. Like we talked about, you know, a Toy Story vibe. There's also certainly a Lego Movie vibe when you think about the toy world versus the real world and stuff like that. And pausing on the Lego Movie for a second, I was getting Elf vibes also, where she starts in one fantastical world and she only knows this world, and then she has to make a whole journey through a, you know, like actual sets that are built to look like they're animated. The journey there with her and Ken to the real world is actually this really well done. This is another one that's like really showing off sets really well, and it feels like a lot of time is passing too, with how many different sets there are and different sort of situations they're in, and it's great. And then she's in the real world. Was definitely giving me Elf vibes. And so it's interesting that it gave me Lego Movie and Elf vibes when Will Ferrell is in both of those movies, and he's also in this movie. So there was a lot of that, it felt like. But there's also stuff that feels intentional and clever in a sense of where we started with the 2001 scene, and of course that's going to play the 2001 theme. And so we get this scene with Gosling walking around in the real world now, and that other version of the 2001, like that version of the 2001 theme that was in Being There, starts playing when Gosling's walking around, and the idea that it feels like a reference to Being There because Gosling walking around in the real world looks a lot like Peter Sellers walking around when that song is playing in Being There, when he kind of first goes out into the world himself. So the fact that it feels like a callback to the 2001 reference while also being a callback to Being There is like a reference to Being There is it's crazy how that happened simultaneously, and it doesn't feel forced either. So that's, if anything, like adding the multiple layer to the reference and making it a reference within a reference, and a reference to its own movie, to its own opening scene, is have I lost anybody yet? There's a lot there, and you'll actually see that a lot of the jokes kind of fit that, where like they've set up the world so well that the jokes fit like within the jokes fit because of references that were made earlier. And it can just feel like the jokes and references feel in this very lived-in place, and the movie is its own thing. And that's pretty fantastic. A lot of that's got to be in the writing, too, with her and Baumbach's script, which is, I'd love to know what the reactions were to this script when, like, Warner Bros. First looked at it in Mattel, because there's a lot of jokes in here. There's especially a lot of jokes at Mattel's expense, and I'm very curious that they're actually in the movie, how they went over, but that's... There's also... It's talking about the script and how people thought about it as it was getting passed around, was when it does start to get to its more sort of profound moments. And so we get stuff like when she starts having these flashes, when Barbie starts having these flashes of what's happened in the real world and realizing that there's a problem, the shots almost get Terrence Malick-like, which is another thing that also might feel maybe intentional, where it's like it starts to turn into an artsy movie almost, and I'm surprised how much that hasn't put people off. Like some of the people we were around at the drive-in were out of their cars, and you could get a vibe from them a little bit, from some of them, that this wasn't the movie they expected. So it's very impressive to do what this movie did and get the reception that it's got and make the money that it's made from the audiences that it had. Like the whole thing feels like this really unique thing that's happened in like the movie world. And I also love the way it avoids doing things that might seem obvious, like from a production standpoint alone. Like how once they're in the real world, you kind of think, oh, this is probably going to be what the movie is then. Like there's the joke where they get arrested twice, which is funny, and how they're going to react to everything and how everybody's going to react to them. There's a funny joke about somebody asking Ken for the time, and and how that that actually is like the catalyst for his whole mission, pretty much. And then once you think that's going to be what the movie is, they go back to Barbie Land pretty quickly, and the movie stays there. And then it's like the after effects of what's been brought in from the real world into Barbie Land. And so the fact that it could have been easy to, start in Barbie Land with this big sort of, production, and then go into the real world, and it's like, well, here in the real world it's significantly cheaper, because they just have to walk around the city. But no, the fact that most of the movie is in Barbie Land is a commitment to the look of the movie and the production values of the movie that I really appreciated. That could have been such an easy way out, but it decides to do something totally different once they're out in the real world, and how they use that, and how they use the way the worlds clash, and it's not just, oh, they don't fit. And that could have been it. That could have been the end of the concept, and it's just the starting point. So I really appreciate that also, and just kind of the surreal quality of a lot of things that are going on here. Um, is great also, and there's a whole sort of massive cast because there's a bunch of different Barbies, there's a bunch of different Kens. I feel like this is one of the few cast lists in movie history where it's a long cast list and most of the cast has the same name, the same character name. But like everyone from like similarly was great as like this sort of this rival Ken, I guess you could call him. There's cameos around. Kate McKinnon has a really fun part that feels tailor made for Kate McKinnon. Um, there is Michael Cera, of course, who is like perfectly cast and has a lot of great and funny moments. Yeah, we could go on all day about the cast. But there's also America Ferrera who comes in from the real world with her teenage daughter, and this is another plot line that feels like it could have been riddled with cliches, but surprisingly isn't. Um, I will say downside to seeing this at the drive-in. This is a drive-in that's like it's a very very nice place, but it's also directly beside a road. And there's some surprisingly loud vehicles at 1 o'clock in the morning that you wouldn't think. But America Ferrera has this really big, profound monologue, and I think I grasped most of it. But at the same time, an ambulance was driving by for a while. So, like, maybe half of that monologue was a little blocked out, but priorities, of course. Whoever the ambulance was for, hopefully they're okay. Also pointing out that, talking about this America Ferrera monologue, though, obviously there was also some criticisms about the movie being preachy, and I can kind of get that. Like I've been of the opinion for a while that if a movie feels like it's sort of setting out to have a message that it doesn't have any shame about screaming at the top of its lungs, I feel like that should be taken into account as far as preachiness goes. Like I almost feel like it could be admired if a director and a writer is basically coming out and saying, the point is that I'm screaming this message at you. It's not like I'm trying to subtly integrate it and then it comes out like I'm screaming it. It's like if they just start off saying, this is going to be what the movie is, this is going to be how the message is delivered, I tend to just kind of give it the benefit of the doubt. So I know, hilariously enough, but also predictably enough, some fragile people were getting really upset about this, and it's really funny to like see like people in their 30s and 40s getting really worked up over a Barbie movie. Even though it does feel like it's more than a Barbie movie, still, that's the world we live in, I guess. But it's probably proving a lot of the points that are in the movie. But the movie does also feel like some of the jokes, like at the expense of guys who are represented by the Kens and then women who are represented by the Barbies. The fact that those are like equally thrown out, where it's like just when they make a joke of like, oh, this is all the stuff that men do and stereotypical men do, they'll turn right around and say, oh, this is all the stereotypical stuff that women do. And the jokes are, like, equally funny. They could seem like low-hanging fruit, I think, might be the problem. And it does, when they do start to get to, like, the message of it, it does start to feel like it gets a bit repetitive, especially in the second half. But there's enough cleverness here that I feel like that's warranted. I still think there's something here that I don't know if it's just the hype surrounding it, which is not the movie's fault, or also if it's just I still can't quite connect to Gerwig, because I feel like with how clever this movie is and creative this movie is, and how the different turns that it took and kind of kept turning itself on its head, I should be going absolutely crazy for it, but I do still feel at a bit of a distance where I'm saying, like, it's really good, and I can see where all the great qualities in it are, especially in the production values. I can't put enough emphasis on that. There's still something that I can't quite get super hyped and excited about. Like, I feel like I should be in a different place with this movie, with everything that's good about it, that's clearly good about it. But I just feel like I'm kind of at a surface level acknowledging, oh, I see what you did here, and that's great. But I'm not, like, passionate about it for some reason. But maybe it's a... The movie is so detailed, and there probably are so many little jokes in there. It's probably something that just needs multiple viewings. So... Which is something that typically happens during award season, so I guess we'll see how that plays out. But yeah, I wish I was more passionate about it, but I can definitely get behind Gerwig and see how her and Baumbach with co-writing, where they're also kind of put in this. You can kind of tell also that it's a movie that was written by a couple, and it's like where we kind of had the, like I said, jokes at the guy's expense and jokes at the women's expense, and how those are kind of, like I said, they were trying to, the people that got really upset were trying to say it was one-sided, but I don't get that vibe at all. It feels very intentionally coming from sort of both angles of this, and Gerwig seems to have the sense of humor that it was something that, while she was trying to make this profound point, it was also something that was probably extremely fun to come up with, and as the ideas rolled in, and then as the script came together, and then ultimately making it, it just feels like it was probably a really fun process also, which is going to come through as well. So, yeah, so I'm good with it. I wish I was a little more passionate, but we'll see how time handles it. So, let's go on to the other movie that played at the drive-in with Barbie, which was Blue Beetle, which I didn't really feel anything about going in. Like I said, I am totally burnt out on the superhero thing, and I just kind of don't care about the genre at the moment, especially with the whole DC thing happening and the James Gunn thing happening, where it's like, yeah, anything that comes out before James Gunn's new movies is basically pointless. It's basically going to be a standalone movie, but I actually think that inadvertently helps Blue Beetle, that, like, knowing it's going to just probably be a standalone movie. Because obviously it ends with a mid-credits sort of cliffhanger kind of thing, but in the fact that it's probably not going to be resolved, usually that's looked at as, oh man, that's going to be so embarrassing in the future, and it's going to make it look like even more of a failure. But like I said, with how franchise heavy we are now, it might actually do this movie good being a standalone movie. I don't, but actually the first thing I want to point out when we talk about where the superhero genre has been lately, I was genuinely surprised, and maybe drive-in projection is just hiding some stuff. I can't really tell. The projection's pretty clear at that theater, but I was really taken by how good the effects are. That was kind of unexpected. When you have a movie like this where it's like, oh, this looks like a movie that would come out in the early 2000s or something, and it's like, oh, and the very sort of, it's like coming in at the worst time for superhero movies, where like a lot of people are finally starting to kind of grow tired of them. That it would feel kind of half-assed, but the effects are much better here than in a lot of the superhero movies I feel like I've seen recently. I don't know if it's just because, like, the freshest one right now is The Flash, which it's like maybe, you know, with that setting the bar as low as possible as far as visual effects go, that could be. But I don't know, the movie looks like really good aesthetically, so, and the way the effects come out, so that was very surprising to me. So when it starts, it spends a lot of time introducing us to the characters, which is actually kind of nice, in this family, and showing how close their bond is, and the different personalities everybody has, and you can kind of pinpoint what part the characters might play as the movie goes on by their personalities. Whether it be, you know, George Lopez being the conspiracy theory uncle, or Adriana Barraza being the grandmother that clearly has some sort of past in this that we're not quite sure of, that's going to have a lot of fun payoffs later. The dad that's, you know, they're potentially losing the house, he's potentially losing his job, and they set up a lot of emotional stakes and all that. And we set up our villain, Susan Sarandon, who's a very interesting bit of casting. And of course a potential love interest, which is predictably going to be the duller parts of the movie itself. So they do like how much time they spent on building up the characters was surprisingly well done, and then we start introducing the superhero angle in this blue scarab that's going to have all the power. And it's going to end up in his hands through a series of events that involve getting it from Susan Sarandon's company, and how she's going to come after him, and that's going to basically be what our very simple story is. And so, and the more simple the story is, the better off a movie like this is going to be also. So, like I said, with superhero movies getting so elaborate and so, baiting franchises and stuff like that, just seeing something that feels rather condensed is just kind of nice. So there's that. But I did start to get concerned a little bit when we were kind of getting introduced to what the suit will be. Like, we're seeing like a computer screen, and it's showing us, what the suit does and what its powers are. And this is cutting back and forth between the introduction of the suit of Blue Beetle, which is going to be very important to a superhero. And this is cut between scenes of his sister talking about taking a shit. That kind of started to feel like a bit of a bad omen, but once the movie got going and, he has his first transformation, it does start to kick into gear a little bit, and it is, like, it does take that vibe back to the earlier superhero movies that weren't taking themselves as seriously, where when he transforms for the first time, it's a scene that's almost purely comedy, while also showing off the effects really well, but I kind of like the fact that it was a comedic scene, because it did kind of feel like it took us back. Like, you could say it's a bad thing that it feels like the earlier ones, because it was before superhero movies got figured out, I guess you could say. Like, it's, or at least what they became now, which it's starting to look better, the superhero movies, the way they used to come. When we were, like, in the era of the first X-Men movie coming out and Raimi's first Spider-Man movie coming out and stuff like that. It feels like it would have been maybe in that era, or more suited for that era. But with that said, what I'm about to say actually doesn't hold the movie back as much as I would have thought. But it is something that becomes a bit overbearing, and that is, if you want to talk about this movie feeling like it's coming out a little too late and it would have thrived maybe 20 years ago, there's a lot of stuff in this movie that feels like other superhero movies, like really specific details, where it just kind of feels like pieces of a lot of Marvel stuff specifically, which for being a DC movie is unfortunate. And it just kind of feels like as the scenes go on, it's like, oh, you could relate this to this or this. Like, to sort of run down the list, there is this obviously he has a comedic scene where he's not sure how the suit works, and then he goes up into space, and that feels a bit like the first Iron Man, of course, when Tony's trying out the suit for the first time. There's a point in time where he says "what" with his palms to his cheeks, exactly the way Deadpool said it at one point, I'm pretty sure. He's often arguing with his suit, that's, trying to do commands, and then he's telling it not to do commands. Feels a lot like the arguments that Peter had with Karen in Spider-Man Homecoming. There's the fact that George Lopez has the La Cucaracha horn, which is something, like, as soon as that happened, my first thought was, oh god, that's a cliche since the beginning of time. And then it only occurred to me later, oh yeah, I think also that was Michael Pena and Ant-Man also. That was like his calling card as well. Like I said, it's been a cliche since forever, but the fact that you can also relate it to the Michael Pena character in Ant-Man, on top of all the other ways you can, see Marvel in here. There's a point where he can go to a certain sort of realm and talk to the dead, and it's like, oh, there's Black Panther. There's a point in time, to go away from Marvel, there's a point in time where he's, like, restrained, and Susan Sarandon's monologuing, and it's like, oh my god, this is literally the scene where they parodied this in The Incredibles. And it's like, I almost expected Sarandon to stop and say, you caught me monologuing, but no, they went with that. So, there's that. There's also a line that Sarandon says around this time where, they're talking about the scarab being attached to him, part of his body, and how if you take it out, you're going to kill him. And so they're talking about how they need the scarab, and Sarandon says, then I'll take it off his corpse. And it's like, which I'm pretty sure is exactly what Ebony Maw said to, I think it was Doctor Strange about the Time Stone in Infinity War in the opening battle scene. So that takes away a little bit, where it's like you can see these little details that are and I don't feel like any of those are stretches either. They feel pretty specifically like, oh, that's literally that thing from that other movie. Now it's just in this movie. And there's so much of that, but like I said, I feel like in a worse movie it would take away more. But Blue Beetle is fine enough by itself that I don't think, like, there's enough charm around those things, and like I said, the action scenes themselves and the effects I feel like are coming through enough that it's fine. But it does have its moments where it kind of slows down. We get two scenes. There's usually one scene where two characters sit in the dark, and we have the, oh, this is the character moment between the action. This is the breather. This is where we build the characters and all that. We get that scene twice in a row. The first time he has it with his love interest, the second time with George Lopez. And the Lopez scene works a lot better than the previous scene, because I don't give a fuck about... I think her name is Jenny, and I only know that because I wrote it down. Where she's like the... Is she the niece of Susan Sarandon, I think it was? So she's a tie-in to our villains, but she's also the love interest, and she's like trying to protect him and all that. And he's trying to protect her. It's a whole thing. They also fly off together at the end, which you could say is similar to him flying off with Zendaya at the end of Homecoming. Or was that Far From Home? It's Far From Home, actually. So that's... I don't really care about the love interest. There's like the moment when this scene is cut off by George Lopez coming in, and it's the scene where they're leading in for the kiss and they get interrupted, and it's like, for fuck's sake, just move along. Like, we don't really need this character that much. But the Lopez scene where we do kind of get more of the familial bond is significantly more important, and so the way they talk about that, and also Lopez in general, is pretty good in this. I can see a lot of people saying he's like a low point of the movie, and he's annoying or something like that. I don't know. I like George Lopez in general, and I thought he was funny as hell here, so that the comedy relief was surprisingly working for me. There were even moments where it was such kind of over-the-top comedy relief, it's like, I feel like I shouldn't like this, but Lopez is able to make the character likable and make it actually funny, so that was working for me at the end of the day. But it does start to feel like it gets long after a while, like the climax becomes multiple climaxes, and it does get stretched out. There's a whole stretch of the movie where they are trying to humanize this henchman that Sarandon has, so you can kind of see the direction that's going to go anyway, long before we get there. It starts to get kind of stroby in places, which is pretty unpleasant and unnecessary, and but before it does start to get to that point, before it gets to the climaxes, it actually reaches its high point, which I think also might have done in the sort of climax here feeling like, oh, it's just another superhero climax, and it's, you know, soulless fighting and effects and stuff like that. The effects are good, but then they kind of start to get excessive a little bit, because the lead into the climax is a scene where we get to the point where the hero is going to seemingly lose everything and then has to fight back. And the direction this takes to set up the stakes and to set up the family being ready to fight back is actually a genuinely, not just a genuinely sad moment, but they went for it harder than I would have thought. And the way the characters play it, the sister especially has a really sort of powerful emotional moment that feels really real. It feels so real in emotion, it almost feels out of place in this movie. But if you're talking about setting up the stakes and putting the hero in a position where he's ready to fight back and the family's ready to fight back, it works really well to take us to the climax. But like I said, once we get to the climax, it does start to feel a bit long. But yeah, that's where it is. So I think that's pretty much what the movie is. Or like I said, I feel like it's doing it a favor that it just feels like it's just going to be one movie, and it's pretty simple. The story's pretty simple. The objectives are pretty simple. The villain's motive is pretty simple. And that's, yeah, and I'm perfectly okay with that, given where superhero movies have gone. That's perfectly fine with me. It's a breath of fresh air. That's great. But it's not a perfect movie by any means. So but that's fine. So, yeah, I think this is going to be the last video that goes up in August, and then we're going to get into all the September and October stuff. So there's a lot of stuff coming. So if you're here, that's great. If you're not, whatever, that's good too. Until all that stuff, I think that's it.